go-to passage, which I guess we can look at it because you can't come to Bible study without looking at the Bible. Let's go to Psalm 36, or I'm sorry, 136. Psalm 136. Of course, we are in the Thanksgiving season, and we're not going to necessarily do a Bible study on this passage today, but we're going to use it to set the stage. I will be actually preaching from this passage on Sunday, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but we will read the first few verses here. So we're in Psalm 136, and let's go ahead and read from Psalm 136. We're going to read verses 1 and 2 and 3.
Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Oh, give thanks to the God of gods, for his mercy endures forever. Oh, give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endures forever.
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Some translations may say his love endures forever. And it's the same kind of idea being communicated. But he says it, give thanks to the Lord. Give thanks to the God of gods. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endures forever. And the rest of the psalm really goes on to detail all of the things that the Lord has done, beginning at creation, how all of the things he created, the heavens and the earth and the sea and the land and all of the creatures that are therein, how he delivered his people from Egypt, how he led them through the Red Sea, how he led them through the desert, how he brought them into the promised land. All of the things that God had done for the people of Israel, he's saying, give thanks to the Lord. And he sums it all up again in verse 26. Oh, give thanks to the God of heaven, for his mercy endures forever. And we are coming upon this season of Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving, frankly, is my favorite holiday. And as Christians, as believers, we really have a reason to give thanks, don't we? In fact, and I'll talk about this on Sunday, so don't let me get too sidetracked on this to here. But the real question of Thanksgiving is not what are we thankful for. We all have many things to be thankful for, and that's a good question. We should count all of the things that we have to be thankful for. But in our society and in our culture, the real relevant question is not what are we thankful for? The question is, to whom are we thankful? You see, Thanksgiving assumes an object of thanks. Who are we giving thanks to? To whom do we give thanks? Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving? If you live in a world where there is no God, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's only blind chance and pitiless indifference, we all evolved from pond scum over the course of millions of years. To whom do we give thanks? To the earth? To the universe? To a little wooden statue of something? All of those things are inanimate objects. All those things are dead gods. They're not living. They're not real. They cannot receive your thanks. To whom do we give thanks? And our psalm answers the question. We give thanks to the Lord. But I do want to talk about this evening. That's a sneak peek for Sunday, but I do want to talk about this evening the holiday of Thanksgiving. Y'all know I'm kind of a history nerd. I like to talk about that stuff. This is a tradition that we celebrate. Most of us probably every year of our entire lives have celebrated this holiday. And I wonder how many of us know why or where the holiday comes from or where the traditions come from. And I think it's important for us to analyze the things we do and understand the roots of the things we do. And so that's what I want to look at this evening is a brief history of Thanksgiving. Beginning with the origins, the first Thanksgiving. Now, we've all have an idea of the first Thanksgiving, right? How does the story of the first Thanksgiving normally go? Well, you've got the Pilgrims, see, and they were fleeing religious persecution from England, and they come across and they land here in America, and then the Indians come and they make friends with the Indians, and they gather a great harvest, and then they all gather together, holding hands around the table, singing Kumbaya. And this is the first Thanksgiving, and it became a tradition that they would follow after year after year after year, all the way down until this very day. And that is the first Thanksgiving. We've seen the plays, we've heard the stories, we know all about that, right? And I think the basic frame of that story is accurate enough, but there are a few details in kind of the popular understanding of Thanksgiving that don't exactly line up with the story that most of us are familiar with. Like I say, the frame is mostly right, but we're going to look a little closer than just the overall frame. Because when we talk about American history in particular, and we think about the Pilgrims and the Thanksgiving, often we think like these are the first people to ever come to America, to ever come to the New World, the first Englishmen to set foot on here, and this is how it all happened. They didn't know what they were doing, and the Indians helped them, and it all worked out. But in reality, there had already been a couple of English colonies in the New World. In fact, the first English colony came to the New World in 1585, and this was the colony of Roanoke. Some of you may have heard of Roanoke. It was established in 1585, and then it was reestablished in 1587, and Roanoke is one of the great mysteries of history, because there was one man in particular who went to England, and then when he came back to Roanoke, everyone was gone. Everybody was gone. No clue where they went. The only thing they found was the name of some Indian tribe written upon a piece of wood. That's the only thing that was left in Roanoke. And more than likely, the people there got conquered by whoever that tribe was, more than likely. Either that or they all died from disease. Either that or, there's no telling what happened. There's books that are written about different theories, but nobody really knows. That was the first English colony. Of course, there had been people here long before that. The Spanish were coming. When did Columbus sail the ocean blue, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So Roanoke came a good 85 years after that. The Spaniards had already been here. The Portuguese had already been. But they were occupying more of Central and Southern America, which left North America open to the British and the French. I know that this is a big history class tonight, but don't worry, we're going somewhere with this. So the second English colony was Jamestown, which I think we all know about, which was established in 1607. So 1607, there was a colony established in North America called Jamestown. Now here's what many people don't know about Jamestown. Jamestown was populated by craftsmen. Jamestown was not populated by farmers and hunters and fur trappers. No, the people that came over and established the colony of Jamestown were like goldsmiths and silversmiths. They were tradesmen, they were craftsmen, because the assumption is that they were going to get here and I don't know, they were going to be walking in fields of gold or something. They saw all of the gold and the silver that the Spanish were bringing back from Central America, and the British thought, hey, we're going to land in North America and it's just going to be fields of gold. So they sent over not people who would know how to establish a permanent colony, but people who would know how to melt gold and craft it into different things. So those people had a really hard time establishing their permanent colony because, once again, they weren't farmers, they weren't builders, they were craftsmen, they were metal workers, they did that kind of a thing. And what happened in Jamestown, in fact, if you've ever seen the movie or heard about Pocahontas, Pocahontas ties in with these Jamestown people because they were having a real hard time, as I say, and the Indians actually came and helped them establish, helped teach them how to farm, helped teach them how to fish and how to live there in North America. There were different groups of Indians that helped these people in Jamestown. And it was actually in Jamestown where we see the first real example of the settlers and the Indians working together, feasting together, fellowshipping with one another, having a fall harvest feast kind of a thing. Like the very beginnings of what we think of as Thanksgiving really happened not in 1621, but in 1607 at Jamestown. Because the Indians, really, if it wasn't for them, that colony probably wouldn't have survived, right? Now, we go on, and then we know about the one that we all hear about, the Mayflower. and the Pilgrims, right? All of these guys come across. And this happens in 1620. And I won't bore you with all the details, but it was a very long and back and forth journey. And because of all of the mishaps on the way over, the Mayflower and the Pilgrims did not land in North America until September. Actually, they took off in September, so they didn't land until like November. It was like November that they landed in North America. And then by the time they really found like the spot they were going to settle, it was December. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Northeast in December, but it's not exactly comfortable weather, right? And upon the Mayflower, they started out with about 102 people. And by the time you get to the end of the winter of that first year, which was only a couple of months, remember, you were down to about 40 people. So between the time they left England to the next spring, over half of the people who had come were dead. And a lot of it was because of, the fact that they landed in New England in December and they didn't have any provisions or any shelter, and they were living on a boat in the middle of the sea. So that was part of the problem. A lot of them died from sickness, from exposure, but they were having a really hard time. And these guys, though, the people who came, the Pilgrims, were what we call Brownists. Has anyone ever heard of that? Has anyone ever heard of Brownists? Brownists. Now, this is what the Puritan separatists were called in England. They were called Brownists. Now, who are the Puritans? The Puritans were a group of people in England who wanted to purify the Church of England from its Catholic tradition, basically. So the Church of England is very Catholic. Even today, the Church of England is very Catholic. There's a lot of similarities. And if you know the history of how the Church of England was founded in the first place, the long and short of it is basically that the king said, actually, I exercise total control in this realm and not the Pope. And so he kind of split away. And there was other things too. That wasn't the only thing, but that was a major aspect of it. But it didn't change all that much in terms of style and form of worship. The major change was, instead of the Pope being the head of the church, it's the King of England who is the head of the church. And there are other significant differences that we're not going to get into right now, but the Puritans were people who recognized this entanglement. And of course, there's a back and forth with the royalty in England. The closer they are to the Catholic French especially, the more Catholicism the Church of England would take on. And the Puritans were like, no, we don't like that. So they're trying to purify the Church of England. And these people are called Brownists. They're called the Brownists. Now, there are, as always, more and less radical sects of the Brownists. There were some that simply wanted to reform the Church of England. And then there were some who wanted to separate altogether. And they, of course, were called separatists. So separatist Brownists were the ones who were occupying the Mayflower. It was separatist Puritans who came from England to North America on the Mayflower. And the idea that a lot of us have is they were fleeing persecution. They were fleeing the state because the state was throwing them in jail because they were preaching against the Church of England or whatever. And that's really not exactly the case. In fact, the English government are the ones who sponsored them to get here. So the English government actually paid for them, in large respect, in several different ways, to come from England to America. And the only condition was that they would establish trade back with Britain. So England didn't want these rabble-rousers running their streets, and they said, well, what do we do with them? Let's send them to the New World. They can start their own colony. They can do their own thing religiously. We'll establish trade in the New World. So it wasn't exactly a situation where they were fleeing the sword. In fact, it was the state that sent them in large respect. But most of the people who came over were separatists. They were Puritans. And they were trying to reform the Church of England. And they had their own religious distinctives, and we don't have to get into that now. Maybe we can do what Brother Chuck said, and we can talk more about those kind of things. But these are the people who came over. Most of them died, but the next spring, they started to make contact with the Indians. These Puritans here at this point, they were in Plymouth, right? Plymouth in Massachusetts. They began to make contact with the Indians. And at first, the first one who came, it was some guy, he just came strutting out of the woods, walked into the camp, and he spoke broken English, but he spoke a little bit of English because he had interacted with traders and trappers and stuff in the past. And he came in and he asked for a beer was the first thing he did. So he came in and he asked the Englishman for a beer, and they got to talking, and he told him, you got to watch out. There's some people, they're hostile. They communicated the best they could. And it wasn't too long after that another group of Indians came out. This time it was a bunch of warriors. And so now you have the English settlers and the Indian warriors, and they're facing off, and no one's really doing anything yet. And then up walks this character most of us have probably heard of, Squanto. Anyone heard of Squanto? For those who haven't, Squanto was a Native American Indian who had been actually captured as a slave, brought back to Europe, and he had to serve as a slave in France and in England. But while he was in France and while he was in England, he learned how to speak French and English. And he learned the French and English culture, and he was basically educated while he was over there. And then he made his way back. He escaped, made his way back to North America. And when he got there, he found that all of his tribe had died. And they all died from disease, more than likely is what happened. In fact, the area where his tribe had been is the area where the settlers had made their location. Remember, they landed in December. They didn't have time to erect a fort. They found an existing village that still had the skeletons of the dead bodies in it. So they were pulling skeletons out of these huts so that they could live in the huts, right? Because it was December in Massachusetts and they just needed a spot to squat, as it were. So Squanto comes and he speaks. Now he's playing mediator between the Indians and the settlers. And basically they work out a treaty. So the treaty is that the Englishmen will help protect these Indian people because they were surrounded by hostiles all around. So the English will help protect them. And the natives were going to help them establish an actual permanent residence, teach them about the land, how to grow the different food, yada, 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 all that stuff. So over the course of the rest of this year now, in 1621, they're working together. The English are securing the perimeter, sometimes by force, sometimes by negotiation. Squanto played a big deal in that. And they're going through, and the Indians are helping them with all the stuff, right? And then we get down to the fall. We get down to harvest time. And you can actually read about this. There's primary source material from the journals of where's the names in here? I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I want to say the names in case you want to look it up. Where is it? I'll come to it, I'm sure, in a moment. I apologize for that. Anyway, so they get there, and now they're like, okay, we have a harvest. Let's go ahead and throw like a big feast, right? So they throw this giant feast, and it's not just like a one-day sit-down for dinner. It is a 3-day fall festival, right? So all the settlers that are there now, they're doing their thing. They go and harvest turkey and fowl and a bunch of fish and all of the stuff that they had grown. And then a group of 90 of this Indian tribe that they had made alliance with, they come and they bring with them a bunch of deer and a bunch of stuff. And for 3 days, they're feasting and partying and doing festivities and all these kinds of stuff, giving thanks to God. And this is what many consider to be the first Thanksgiving. The very first Thanksgiving. And here at this thing, they ate turkey, they ate deer, they ate other kinds of birds, eel, cod, shellfish, squash and pumpkins and corn and all kinds of things. And they, like I say, they were giving thanks to God, they were partying, they were feasting. This was, in fact, the first Thanksgiving that many people consider. And we all know the rest of the history as things play out. And I heard people, as I was researching for this, I listened to some people talk, and they say, everything you learned about Thanksgiving was wrong. It was totally wrong. And then they would go on and they would basically tell the same story I just told, which is more or less the same story that we all have heard growing up. And then they say, so, that part, the story about Thanksgiving is actually kind of right, but it's all the stuff that happened over the next several decades that they don't tell you about. And, I don't know about you, but I learned about all of the atrocities committed against the natives when I was in school. In fact, you hear more about that today than you hear about anything else. If you study early American history today, that's like all anybody wants to talk about. But the reality is that when it comes to the story of the first Thanksgiving itself, this is the story. And the story has to do with how they were working together, the pilgrims who were very religious, giving thanks to God for the help of the Indians, for Squanto, for their harvest, for the fact that they survived and they were beginning to thrive. This was the first Thanksgiving. And yes, a lot of things would happen later on in history, but that doesn't actually have anything to do with the first Thanksgiving. That's all stuff that happened in history. So I would urge caution when trying to go that route. Now let's talk about the holiday itself for a moment. As you can tell from the pilgrims, the Puritan pilgrims who came over, the religion has always been a central part of American culture. From the very beginning, there was a very strong emphasis on religion in the American culture. And it was no different way back in the day. In fact, it's only recently that has begun to change. And even if you look at the statistics today, there is still a large portion of the United States that claims to be religious in some form or fashion. It's much less than it used to be, but it's still a pretty significant number. But it is dwindling. In fact, George Washington declared the first national day of Thanksgiving in 1789. So this celebration of Thanksgiving, having a day of Thanksgiving, the first one to do it was George Washington in 1789. This is at the very beginning. The very beginning of the Republic. George Washington, the first president, he declares a national day of Thanksgiving. And that happened then. In fact, over the next 100 years or so, there were several states that had holidays, Thanksgiving holidays, in the fall, either late October to late November. In this harvest season, several states in the Union had days of Thanksgiving. This was kind of a part of the American ethos. It was kind of a thing, but it wasn't on a national scale. It wasn't like what we celebrate today. And that all began to change, and you have one person you can really thank for modern Thanksgiving, and that person's name is Sarah Josepha Hale. Has anyone ever heard of her before? Sarah Josepha Hale. She is the godmother of Thanksgiving, okay? If it wasn't for her, we would probably not have a national day of Thanksgiving that we're going to be celebrating. Sarah Josepha Hale was born in 1788, and she lived until 1879. Now, she was the driving force behind Thanksgiving. She was a prolific author around the time of the Civil War. She was just a huge prolific author. She wrote for the biggest magazine, I think it was, in the nation at the time of the Civil War. And for over 20 years, she was trying to get public support for this idea of having one national day of Thanksgiving. All these states had their own. Well, she was the one who had this idea. Why don't we just have one for the whole nation? And she was pushing and pushing and pushing. She wrote about it year after year after year, trying to garner public support. She would write letters to the presidents. She wrote letters to 3 different presidents, urging them to declare a national day of Thanksgiving. In fact, she would go around and write recipes for Thanksgiving meals and publish them in the newspapers, trying to encourage people to get in this Thanksgiving theme. She wrote novels and essays that had Thanksgiving themes. She was like the Thanksgiving queen, okay? She was all about Thanksgiving. She published many recipes, as I say, and in these recipes, it included things like roasted turkey, pumpkin pie, things of this nature, right? So this is, like I say, this is going back now into the middle of the 1800s. This is going back now to the time of the Civil War. This has been a tradition in the United States all the way from the colonial days. George Washington declared a day of Thanksgiving. But by the time you get to the middle of the 1800s in the Civil War, it was like a part of culture. States had it. You had this one, even the turkey and the pumpkin pie. This was a part of it, even then. Now, as I say, she wrote all kinds of different presidents. And the third president who was in office while she was doing her thing was a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. He received a letter from this woman in the middle of the Civil War, during the peak of the Civil War, the bloodiest year of the Civil War, which was in 1863. he gets this letter from Sarah Hale, and Abraham Lincoln thinks to himself, he says, you know what? I think this is a good idea. And his idea, his goal in all of this was to have something that would unify the people. And it wouldn't be like, this is something for the North and this is something for the South, but this is something for the American people. And you can go in and you can read his address, his proclamation of the day of Thanksgiving. You can read it. It's available, and you will see his language used. He wants to unify the country behind this idea of Thanksgiving, a day of Thanksgiving. So he really takes her up on that because he sees it as a great opportunity to unify a divided country. And then, since Abraham Lincoln did that, it became a tradition. He did it the last Thursday of November in the year 1863, and then it became an informal tradition where every president called for a unified day of Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. So every president from Abraham Lincoln up until 1941, which we'll talk about in a moment, every single one after that, they called for a national day of Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. The day that we do it, that goes back to Abraham Lincoln. That goes back to the middle of the 1800s. That goes back to the Civil War. Of course, remember though, it was the last Thursday. The last Thursday. And that goes on, like I say, for what? 100 years almost. 80 years. 80 years that's going on. Until 1941. In 1941, Congress declared Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. And FDR was the president at the time. He's the one who signed it. He did a day of Thanksgiving. He issued a proclamation, but it became an official American holiday in 1941. And in the law, of course, you can read this as well, and it's this way to this very day. The American holiday is to be celebrated the fourth Thursday of November. So Abraham Lincoln started the tradition of the last Thursday. It had gotten moved around a little bit in that time, but then it's law. 1941, the fourth Thursday of November, that becomes Thanksgiving. So that's the holiday. That's where the holiday came. That's how that developed. We saw the origin story. We looked at the first one. This is how the holiday developed. Now, what about the tradition? There are several traditions surrounding Thanksgiving, and I found a lot of this to be quite interesting. So I hope this isn't boring to you. I know I'm doing a lot of talking. I'm trying to rush through because I got some questions I want to ask. Let's look at some traditions. What about the food? It's the food, right? So who came up with all these food ideas? We already talked about Sarah Hale back in the 1800s issuing these recipes, including turkey and pumpkin pie. But let's look at this. William Bradford, this is who it is. These were the people from the first Thanksgiving. William Bradford, who was the governor of the colony at Plymouth. His name was William Bradford. He writes about the Thanksgiving in his own journal. There's another man by the name of Edward Winslow, who was another man who was present at the colony. He writes about the first Thanksgiving. He writes about the contact with the Indians. You can read about that in their writings. Those are primary historical sources. You can read about these things. But they mention the food that they ate at the first Thanksgiving. We already mentioned it: turkey, eel, waterfowl, deer, corn, squash, and different things that they grew from their harvest. These were the first meal at the first Thanksgiving. Going all the way back, turkey was kind of a part of that deal, right? Because there's a lot of wild turkeys in North America. Something that a lot of people don't know, I didn't know this, through much of early American history, the main stuffing ingredients, so they would stuff turkeys, but they didn't stuff turkeys with bread, they stuffed them with oysters. And oysters were like a primary filler food in the early American colonies because they were just everywhere. There was so much of them. So they would stuff their turkeys with oysters. Oysters were like just a main filler food in a lot of dishes. So that's kind of where the idea of stuffing came from. Of course, that evolved over time as oysters became more rare. Yeah, oysters for stuffing. How's that? Yummy, yummy.
That's what I was raised on.
You like oysters, huh?
Yeah, it was oyster stuffing.
Oyster stuffing. See, I had never heard about that.
Sounds slimy.
Yeah, it doesn't sound.
It might have been the cook.
May have been. Oftentimes, if a food ain't good, it is the cook. I'll tell you what. Oftentimes, that is. Many such cases. But not always. So that's that. Now, what about cranberry sauce? Cranberry sauce is another big one. Where did this come from? Well, as early as 1672, cranberry sauce is mentioned in cookbooks, English cookbooks and American cookbooks. In fact, in the widely published American cookbook from 1796, it's called American Cookery, cranberry sauce is specifically listed as a dish to serve with turkey. So you cook your turkey with cranberry sauce and with onions, it says. So this has been a part of the American English diet for a very long time as well. What about sweet potatoes? Sweet potatoes and marshmallows. Does anyone eat that? Sweet potatoes and marshmallows. I love it. My wife does not like sweet potatoes, but I love it. What about that? Where did that come from? Well, marshmallows didn't really become a thing until like the late 1800s. And marshmallows, when they actually began, were like a French delicacy. They were very expensive. But some Americans got a hold of it, and that old good capitalist spirit got a hold of them. And they figured out a way how to mass produce marshmallows for very cheap. And so that they were able to go on and then sell them mass produced. So they became widely available by the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in fact, there is a recipe booklet from a major marshmallow producer that was produced in 1917. And one of the recipes in this marshmallow booklet was sweet potatoes with marshmallows. So that one goes back at least to the early 1900s. Now the big one, my personal favorite, pumpkin pie. What about this pumpkin pie thing? Where did this come from? Well, again, there are English cookbooks in the 1600s that talk about making pumpkin pie. So as far back in American history as you can go, people were eating pumpkin pie. And of course, if it's made out of pumpkins, pumpkins are harvested in the late summer, early fall. There's no doubt that these pumpkins were being used at pumpkin pie. I'm sure there was some pie even at the very first one. You remember what Sarah Hale said, turkey and pumpkin pie. In fact, there was a newspaper in Connecticut, a large Connecticut newspaper in 1869 talking about Thanksgiving, and it declared that turkey and pumpkin pie were the inevitable Thanksgiving dishes. And that's in the 1860s. So this stuff goes back pretty far. Like the foods that we eat today, by and large, for the most part, are the same foods that were being eaten in the 1600s, and the 1700s, and the 1800s. Like, this has been a pretty long-lasting meal tradition in our culture, which I find to be pretty interesting. But there's another big tradition of Thanksgiving. This is more modern. What about the Macy Day Parade? Everyone knows about the Macy Day Parade, right? Where did this come from? Well, there was a holiday in New York City that dates back to the time of the Revolution, and it was called Evacuation Day. And Evacuation Day was a celebration in New York City where they celebrated when the British were forced to evacuate from New York City during the Revolutionary War. And this Evacuation Day was celebrated for a long time in various ways, shapes, or forms. For about 100 years it was celebrated. But some of the ways they would do it, they had street parties and parades, and people would dress up in costumes, and they would it was like a big festival, but the festival oftentimes included parades. And you could really say this is the beginnings of this New York Macy's Day Parade, going all the way back even to Evacuation Day, which was celebrated, like I say, until 1888. So pretty much 100 years in New York City, this was celebrated in some different ways. And there's some other traditions there too that if you're from up there, you know about. What is it, like ragamuffins? The kids that go around begging for stuff. That's part of it, and I'm not going to talk about all that, but it's all part of the thing. But this was like specifically in the New York area. This was happening. So the first Macy Day Parade, though, happened in 1924. The first Macy's Day Parade was in 1924, and it had floats, and it had circus animals, and it had all kinds of things, and they did the parade or whatever. And the Macy's Day Parade has happened every single year since, except for 3 years. 1942, 1943, 1944. What was happening in that time?
World War II.
World War II. That's the only time since 1924 that there wasn't Macy Day parades was those 3 years that we were involved in World War II. There's been one every year except for those 3 years. The first time that it was televised was in 1953. Remember that date because we're going to hear it again. The first time the Macy's Day Parade was televised was in 1953. There's another tradition that we know of, the turkey pardon. Has anyone ever heard of the turkey pardon? Where the president pardons the turkey? Well, what about this? When did this start? This actually started with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to pardon a turkey on the first Thanksgiving declared in 1863. The first Thanksgiving, the first turkey pardon. And the way the story goes is that they brought the turkey home to slaughter. And Abraham Lincoln's son said, "Daddy, please don't kill the turkey." And so he relented and he didn't kill the turkey. He pardoned the turkey. And that was the very first one. And it's happened a few more times. Another very famous one was in 1963 when JFK pardoned a turkey. And what happened is 3 days later, he was assassinated in Dallas. 3 days after the turkey pardon. And that was in 1963 that JFK did that. Now, it was in 1989 that George H.W. Bush really established the every year tradition. And since 1989, with George H.W. Bush, every president that's in office every single year does the turkey pardon. And it's been that way since 89, though it was a tradition before then as well. It just wasn't as consistent as it is now. Yeah, go ahead.
We don't have cranberries down here.
Uh-huh.
And they don't have anything at all.
Uh-huh.
So how did they do sugar up there to their...
Probably sugar beets.
Well, they got sugar. Just because they couldn't grow the sugar doesn't mean they didn't have the sugar. Because what you have is the Spanish colonies in South and Central America grew sugar. In the West Indies and in those different areas, they grew sugar. And then that sugar, of course, would go back to Europe. And then from Europe, it would go to Britain. And then from Britain to the colonies.
Okay, we don't have cranberries, so how do you get cranberry sauce?
Well, of course.
Yeah, Walmart.
Well, of course, cranberries do grow in the north, and people just bring them down to the south. But you got to remember, in the early times, there wasn't, I'm sure that the colonies in Virginia might not have used a lot of cranberry sauce, but the ones in New England certainly did. And then, of course, there's always been trade up and down. So they'll bring the cranberries down, we'll bring the tobacco up. It's just, trade goes on. It's just trade. But yeah, so that's how it would kind of move around. A fun fact, a lot of people don't know this, horses are not native to America. Potatoes are not native to Europe. Bananas are not native to... I don't remember if bananas came from here or if they came from there. I can't remember exactly. But there was a lot of trade that went on between Europe and the New World, and it totally throwed everything off. A lot of things were introduced. A lot of things were introduced into Europe. And so just the trade is how all of that worked. But they would get the sugar from Central America. And it would go from Central America to Europe to America.
I was just curious about it, because I didn't think all Thanksgivings ate the same thing, north and south, and probably why the Civil War happened.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it.
They couldn't have the cranberry sauce.
Yeah, that was probably the main reason, I imagine, that the Civil War was fought. It all started with the Thanksgiving dinner disagreement. And it just spread from there. I can buy that for sure.
Here I am.
Okay, one last tradition, because Thanksgiving just wouldn't be Thanksgiving without the football games, right? So what about the football thing? I have to throw this in here. So, football. Now, even back in the 1800s, you had college football teams playing on Thanksgiving Day. In the 1800s, this was happening. So this is another one that's an old tradition. The NFL came around in 1920. And by the time you get to they played on Thanksgiving, different teams did, but in 1934, something unique happened. The Detroit Lions decided that they wanted to play on Thanksgiving Day, basically as a marketing stunt. They had just moved to Detroit. There was baseball teams that were very popular. The Lions were trying to kind of boost their numbers and get their name out there. Well, what the Lions were able to do in 1934 was to get a broadcasting deal so that the Lions football game would be broadcasted to the whole nation. And this was a relatively new thing on radio, right? So it was broadcasted to the whole nation in 1934, and it was a huge success. It was a smashing hit. And then the Lions then have played every single Thanksgiving Day since 1934, with the exception of 3 years. What do you think those 3 years are? 42, 43, 44. During that time of World War II, right? That's the only time that the Lions have not played on Thanksgiving was during World War II. The first time it was televised, what year do you think was the first year that game was televised? 1953. CBS picked it up 3 years later in 1956. But we all know the Lions aren't the only team that play on Thanksgiving now, are they? Who else plays on Thanksgiving? The Cowboys. 1966. They decide, I want to get in on this Thanksgiving Day action. So they did the same thing. They wanted to replicate the success. They began playing on Thanksgiving. It was a smash hit. It was successful. The Cowboys, since 1966, have played every single year on Thanksgiving except for 2 years. And this time it wasn't because of World War II. The NFL was trying to do something different. They wanted to do some games in St. Louis. Didn't work out. Went back to the Cowboys. And the Cowboys have done it every year since. The Lions and the Cowboys always play on Thanksgiving. So those are some of the main traditions. That's kind of the history of Thanksgiving. That's where all this stuff came from. Now I want to hear from you. We talked about many traditions. What are traditions that y'all have? I want to hear what are y'all's Thanksgiving traditions? What do y'all got?
I know there's a parade that's older than, and it's just as famous when you get up to the Northeast as the Macy's Days Parade. But people don't know about it. It's called the Mummers Parade.
The Mummers
It's
Parade.
been going on since the 1800s. It's
Okay.
out of Philadelphia, but the people from New York all know about it. These guys spend tens of thousands of dollars for these different suits with feathers on them and stuff. They look like giant turkeys and stuff. But they all play these musical instruments. It's a lot of jazz type thing. It's almost like being down in New Orleans. But they do it uniformly, like in the military or whatever. Check it out sometime, the Mummers. The
Mummers Parade, yeah.
It's just as famous up there.
Yeah. What do you think maybe a reason that people don't know about that one as much as the Macy Days one?
It's
Television.
locally televised, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably it. This television, because the Macy's Day Parade is broadcast to the whole nation every year. And so if they would have picked the Mummers Parade, that would probably be the one everyone knew about.
It's been going on for late 1800s.
Yeah, very cool. Anything else? Is there any unique traditions?
What is the traditional, just pumpkin pie, is it?
That's like the main dessert, yeah. Pecan pie, yeah.
Cherry pie.
Yeah. All kinds of pies, yeah.
My mother and I had a tradition. Nobody else really did it, but we would always watch the Macy's Day Parade while we were doing our cooking. And even though Mom's gone, I still watch the parade while I'm cooking.
Yeah.
So you just hold to that. I just love it.
I do that too, Bobby.
Watches it. Yeah, it starts early. It starts 9 o'clock Eastern time. That's crazy. Turducken. Y'all do turducken? You know, that's a really old thing too. That goes all the way back to the English monarchy. They were eating that in the 1600s. Turducken.
Famous like Don Madden.
Yeah, John Madden. Yeah. Is there anything else? Any other things that? Is there anything like particular to the South? Is there anything particular to Texas? I'm not from, so I don't know.
When I married into a Southern family, because my parents were from up north and everything was Northern Yankee food, I had to get used to cornbread stuffing.
Cornbread stuffing?
You know, because I never knew what it was. Yeah.
Didn't like
They
it.
made white bread dressing.
We made oyster
Yeah.
They
stuffing.
got a white bread.
Yeah.
We'd stay up the night before and make our oyster stuffing.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this may have passed, but for a while it was a real big thing to try to do a deep fried turkey.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, apparently too many people put a turkey that wasn't totally thawed in the hot grease and caught fire.
Yeah, that happens.
All those guys do days.
Fried turkey is good. I love me some fried turkey.
But in the South, if we cut up fried, you would be amazed how many things you cut up fried.
That's right. That's right. That's true. I never had a fried turkey until I came to Texas. My mom always makes fried turkey. The fried turkey is really good. I'm not really a big fan of turkey. I don't really like turkey. I don't even cook turkey on Thanksgiving.
I do ham.
You ham? Yeah, I like ham too.
Better than regular.
Yeah.
Now my brother cooked a turkey called a tipsy turkey.
Tipsy turkey. Yeah.
Basted it in cognac.
Okay. You
All
baste
night
it?
long.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if you could make like a beer can turkey. You'd have to get like a 40-ounce turkey. I don't know how that would work. Yeah. But that's interesting. Yeah, we don't do turkey. We do brisket and ham. And then if I'm fortunate to kill something, we always do deer as well.
Do you have a good deer? Salami?
Not salami, no.
I think it's salami. My girlfriend from yeah.
Yeah.
Her husband lived in deer with his buddies.
Deer salami. That sounds good. I would like that. I love me some of those cured meats, that kind of stuff. Really good.
Back in the day when I ate meat, it was
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Probably can get it all.
That's good stuff. Yeah. Well, I don't really have much else. Like I say, this was a little bit different. I know this is not our typical Wednesday night Bible study. Yeah.
Pardon me, the teacher in me. I've had a lot of people who get upset at the separation of church and state. It's in the Constitution. No, it's not. The background to it started back in England when the Church of England would collect taxes. And it was the state-sponsored religion, and you had all these rules that were sponsored by the state. It could become law. And so when we got over here, it was kind of like, we don't want the government telling the church how it has to run. So the phrase, the separation of church and state, was written by Thomas Jefferson talking to the Danbury Baptists, telling them that here in America, we wanted freedom of religion, and we did not want the state running the church.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now the non-Christians have got a hold of that, and there's so many people who are convinced separation of church and state is in the Constitution, and I think it means that Christians and religious people should have nothing to do with the government, and that is not our history.
Yep, that's exactly right.
It's on the corner.
It was mentioned in the Supreme Court case in 1943, I think it was. But it was a reference back, if you go back and look and see either the Federalist Papers or what Thomas Jefferson had to say, you find out it was the Danbury Baptist Church and the Baptists were afraid that the government was going to impose, like the Church of England,
Yeah.
a state church. So he promised basically, no, the government will be subdued to the church.
Yeah.
They're separate, but the church won't have to worry about that.
Another thing a lot of people don't know is that, especially in the early American states and the original constitutions of a lot of states, there were a lot of states that had state churches. The federal government didn't have a state church, but like North Carolina had a state church, Vermont had a state church, and in a lot of constitutions there was rules like you cannot run for public office unless you're a Trinitarian believing Christian. So this was always a part of our tradition. Go ahead.
This is something that makes me very sad. One of the first court cases that got used as precedents for pulling mentions of God out of public school is, I don't remember where, school used to have like a little church, I can't think of the word, chapel, once a week, and different ministers from different denominations would come in and do the little short chapel service. Well, one of the Catholic priest was like, our setup is a big deal, and the holy water and just everything. Do you mind bringing them to our church so we can show them Catholic communion like it's supposed to be? And then a Baptist church got all upset because now we were going to be sponsoring Catholic. And just because he said, can you bring them to the church? And instead of working it out as Christian brothers and sisters, it went to a law, it went to court, and they said, no, we can't use government funds to bus the children to a church. And I'm sad to say that it was fighting between denominations was the key to how they finally had a precedent to kick God out of schools.
Very interesting. Yeah, there's a long and storied tradition in American history of not being particularly kind to the Catholics. So that is kind of an American tradition, I suppose.
A real quick story.
Go ahead.
The woman who got, who was involved, it was her court case that got the Christianity out of the schools. She was a Jewish atheist, and she was using her son as a defense. And she was so happy that she was victorious. Long story short, her and her daughters went down, I believe it was in Central America or Mexico, and they were murdered violently. And it's just the irony behind it. And her son ended up becoming a pastor.
Wow.
You know, our country based on our currency,
Yeah, it's amazing.
it's everywhere.
You don't make fun of
That's
God.
what it should be.
He has the boy ended up becoming a pastor.
I
And they all died quietly.
All right. Well, like I say, I know this was a little different. I hope this was enjoyable for y'all. Like I say, if there's something particular, if like there's questions or stuff, if y'all want to get that to me, and that'd be good, because I think it would be good to be able to talk about what's on everybody's mind. Like I know what's on my mind, but it's a good thing to hear what's on your mind, and maybe we can talk about some of that stuff. I think that would be useful. So if you got something like that, let me know, and we can try to work some stuff in. And we will not be having Bible study next week, but when we come back the week after that, we're going to finish up on the 12 disciples. And then in December, it's going to be like all Christmas. So Christmas themed December. We're going to be talking about all kinds of Christmas stuff in December. But we will finish what we started on the 12 disciples last week. We're going to finish that, not next week, but the week after. Okay? And then in December, it's the holiday time. We're going to focus on that stuff. So any other questions, thoughts, comments before we close?
Wall Builders is an excellent site if you want to learn about any of this stuff. So from a Christian perspective, the history and all these little behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Or David Fetterman.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, will you close us in prayer, sir?